Okay, so welcome everybody. Right now we are going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges lesbians, gay, bisexual, trans, two-spirit, queer questioning plus youth may experience in and beyond schooling. So does anyone have any ideas as to what gender, sexual, and romantic minorities may experience in terms of difficulties? Callie?
An idea. So I think that one of the first kind of like issues is information being available to queer youth. So I find that I found in the past with my own personal experiences and with talking to other queer individuals that I know in my life, that not having an inclusive curriculum at all for sex ed or for like pretty much anything that doesn't talk about queerness at all is really negatively impacting queer youth, because they don't know, half the time they don't even know how to identify, because they might find labels later in life, but especially like for youth that are in ages 14 to 18, like finding an identity category is so important at that age, because it helps make you feel like you belong. And more so beyond that, I find particularly with the sex ed curriculum, queer youth are at, because they're not getting that sex ed in school, not that heterosexual cisgender people are getting great sex ed either, but when it comes to queer youth, they are at a higher risk of unsafe sex practices, or they are relying on getting this information from the internet, which we know isn't always true.
Absolutely. So access to information, resources, education that helps people make sense of their lived experiences and identities. Awesome.
Yeah, I just want to add kind of like zoning in, not necessarily with sex ed, but just kind of like I think that heteronormativity is like a big issue, just and more so including language. Like I don't think that kids realize or even adults realize how much the language that you use impacts like the way that you think when you're younger. So using like inclusive language, especially in like a teaching setting, I think is really important, not really like gendering everything or things like that. I think it would help a lot.
Yeah, so what are some examples of being gender neutral or using terms that are more inclusive? So we have, for example, partner rather than boyfriend or girlfriend.
Instead of like being like, oh, your mom and dad, maybe your parents.
When you're addressing a room, you can say, hi friends, hi folks, rather than saying boys and girls or whatever. It's just kind of a more inclusive way to address everybody. And in that way, like also you're not saying hey guys and using guys as like a default masculine term.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
The original question, I would say that having a sense of community is always important as well. A lot of these students come from places where their houses don't accept them, or their general community might not accept them, maybe their place of worship doesn't accept them. So having a spot in the school is always something that is helpful, because they might not even feel accepted in the school. So maybe it's just if you're a teacher, you're a classroom, or you're a GSA space, having that, because they don't have that in other places.
Absolutely.
I mean, as an immigrant myself, I feel I'm really interested in how different identities intersect with each other, and I feel that's something schools need to understand and be more sensitive to. So I feel like schools, teachers in particular, would need more training to understand how they can sensitively speak about some of these issues. And I think speaking about queer issues is so important in our schools, because students don't see themselves represented in the things we discuss in the classrooms. So I think when teachers understand why this is important, they will include more people from minority groups and make them the center of the stories that they bring up in classrooms.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think one challenge that comes to mind is like the physical violence, and how physical violence, particularly against like queer bodies, is often minimalized. And like in a school setting, that it's bullying, it's boys being boys, or it's it's no big deal, they'll sort of grow out of it. It's just pranks, it's just fun. But you're like, oh no, that's physical assault, or that's physical violence, and having to sort of live with that day in, day out at school.
So what I'm thinking right now is kind of a combination of what Abby and Kelsey were saying in terms of, I'm thinking about people's identities being minimized, or people, like when you're a gender or sexual minority, I feel sometimes that you're not allowed to speak about your own identity because it's considered not to be professional, or not to be, or to be too private or inappropriate for classroom discussion, and where everybody, and I guess it goes to heteronormativity as well, but everyone else is allowed to bring that piece of themselves into the classroom. And then I think further to that, when I think about disciplinary measures, I find that sometimes because of this, it means that when a youth or another student who's a gender or sexual minority, speaks up about being bullied, or I don't know, some kind of like excessive punishment, they're often asked to explain what part their identity played in having that violence enacted on them. And I don't see that for members of other groups as often.
As I've been listening to all of you, whether it's diversity in curriculum, the explicit pressure for heteronormative in school and beyond the community, the knowledge and how teachers interact, bullying, it really brings out the lived experience of queer youth that are characterized by stigma, rejection, and discrimination. And as a psychologist, I think about why wouldn't a queer youth not struggle from anxiety and depression? Mm-hmm. Think about the systematic discrimination and oppression that a youth live through day by day. So when I think about these challenges and I'm asked to come to a school or community to provide therapeutic services to a queer youth, one of the first things that I point out that a mental health of a queer youth will never be effectively addressed if the system does not change for them, right? So because my 50-minute session for 1 year, 2 or 3 years will not really make a lot of change if as soon as they leave my office, those systematic oppression comes back. Mm-hmm. So for me, the issues are very much at the systematic level, but unfortunately, and rightfully so, has such an impact at the personal level. Mm-hmm. So the issues are very systematic, but impact are very personal. And the policies and interventions has to be at the systematic level, not just relying on the person who's learned coping skills. And you can breathe as much as you want, but if you're in an oppressed environment, it doesn't really help.
Yeah, I think on a similar train of thought is that sometimes like the struggles that youth are facing are often assumed to be solely because of them struggling with an identity or trying to figure something out. And sometimes that might be like the most exciting part if like they're in a healthy environment and they have an accepting home life. That might be like a really exciting part that they're exploring, but also are maybe seeking help for anxiety that is rooted in a different issue. And mental health professionals and teachers, and there's a lot of assumptions that like, oh, you're gay. Like that's why you're struggling so much. That's why you're depressed. So if we tell you it's okay to be gay, it's going to be good now. Like you'll be fine. Instead of like, that can be a really happy part of somebody's life, and it might be something entirely different. So that kind of becomes somebody's, especially for youth, it kind of becomes their whole identity in a system that assumes that that's the odd part out.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Does anyone else have any other contributions? Kelly?
Yeah, so kind of going off of Kelsey and Maisha's point, one of the other things too that it's not just necessarily a school thing, it's more of a societal-wide issue, but I feel that it's often rears its head and is highlighted within our mainly middle school and secondary schooling system, is that when it comes to the way that we address homophobic-related bullying, a lot of the times it's actually not even queer youth that are being targeted, and when we look at bullying as being like a homophobic related bullying, we look at it as a queer issue, but there's a lot of students who or youth who might identify as being heterosexual or cisgender, but they also experience the same bullying. And so when we look at bullying, we need to look at it from a perspective, from a societal level of like heteronormativity, because it's that structure, it's that institution that is causing this behavior to happen. And often we sometimes miss out on supporting students because like we might assume things about their identity, and then we don't give them the proper support because we don't see them as being an impacted party that a queer youth that we know might also be like affected in the same way. So like when you're in the classroom, for example, and you hear this language, you need to really break down and discuss with the students why they're using this language, because they're not just using this homophobic and transphobic language against queer students. It's happening to all types of students that just don't fit whatever particular mold that is perceived.
So I think it's really great in terms of what you've shared. So you've highlighted some huge systemic issues that obviously happen in the media, in schooling, in some religious institutions, and how those trickle down and they have impacts on individuals, so the individual lives of LGBT2Q plus youth. So just to summarize some of the great contributions that you've made, we do know that there is excessive harassment, discrimination, and stigma targeted towards sexual, gender, and romantic minorities. But that doesn't happen, obviously. It's not a monolithic group, as I said before, that everybody has individual experiences, and that's really rooted in their individual social locations. So race, class, religion, sexual orientation, gender, identity, and that really impacts the way people are perceived and treated in society, right? And that really leads us to the point about intersectional oppression. And many of you actually highlighted this, right? So how we all have different interlocking identities and how those identities impact the way in which, as I said before, we are perceived and treated in society. And oppression is compounded, obviously, when we are a minority in many ways, right? So if we are racialized and queer and have a disability, our experiences in living in this world are obviously different than those who locate privileged, more privileged identities. Callie?
The one thing that's important to remember when talking about intersectionality is that part of how intersectionality operates in the way that we understand it is that like you can't remove someone's identity from an incident that they encounter. Mm-hmm. So for example, let's say you have a queer youth who's being bullied. You can't look at them as just a queer youth. You have to take into account other factors that also then impact that. So if the student's a racial minority, and maybe that's also playing a role. If the student, because in every lived experience, there always is one identity that really is kind of what is really obvious, but you also have to like look beyond the surface and see what's beneath so you can fully understand the situation. And you have to take into account every identity marker that intersects within that person.
Absolutely. Does anyone have any other insights or add-ons with respect to intersectionality?
Sorry, it's a women's studies key term. It's my major.
Okay, so now we talked a little bit about heteronormativity. So basically how being heterosexual is privileged in society, in the ways we speak, in curriculum, in the ways we interact, and how it's expected. And the same thing with cisnormativity. So how being cisgender, so when you're assigned sex at birth, aligns with your gender identity, how that's kind of privileged in and through society, through the structures, for example, in gendered washrooms and things like that, or gendered language. So, and how we have to be really mindful of the ways in which we're speaking and really think about the different policies we have in place that actually, largely actually negatively impact a lot of trans, non-binary, gender queer individuals. People talked about mental health issues and how those can be exacerbated with gender, sexual, and romantic minorities. Not, and as Annalise said, not simply because you are a sexual minority, for example, but it's because of the experiences you face with, for example, heterosexism. Or sorry, not heterosexism. Yes, heterosexism. Sorry, in society. So it's really important to understand that it's not being a minority in and of itself, it's the experiences of oppression that can lead to negative mental health and well-being.
Also, the way that we frame queerness in society, we just automatically assume that a queer youth is going to be experiencing mental health issues, which isn't always the case. But with that in mind, when you're engaging with a queer youth and they're struggling with mental health, you can't just assume it's because of their queerness. You have to because I know with some of my friends, that's where the conversation stopped and ended, where it's like, oh, you're gay? Oh, that's why you're depressed. And it's like, there's actually a lot of underlying issues that are completely unrelated to that, but the way that we frame queerness in our society, it's just easy for us to go, oh, you're sad right now because you're gay. And when in reality, a lot of times those issues aren't the reason for that mental health issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And some people talked about acceptance and belonging and safety and how that's really important. It has to be prioritized for a lot of queer and trans youth. Acceptance and belonging in all avenues, whether it's family, whether it's at work, whether it's in schooling, that needs to be a focus. Having precarious housing, potentially being kicked out of your home situation because people are not in agreement, in quotations, with your sexual and or gender minority status or identity. And how coming out can be an issue as well. Really understanding yourself. And it comes back to what Callie said about access to resources and knowledge and understandings in the curriculum, but also just online. And coming out to yourself and then coming out to others, if that's something you choose to do that is important to you to do. We talked about misgendering and mispronouncing, and that's based on the expectation or assumption that most people are cisgender, and that we know how they want to be referred to just by looking at the person. We know that's not the case. And what Melanie was talking about, so excessive discipline, and how queer and trans youth are disciplined to a greater extent in school. In particular, we have research to suggest that, and how that's even exacerbated when someone happens to be racialized and queer. So we do know from research that if there is a queer couple who are, for example, holding hands or engaging in a kiss, for example, in the hallway, that they may be treated differently just because they are queer. And if there is a heterosexual couple, they, maybe the teacher or administrator would just walk down the hall, and how that's really problematic. Does anyone have any other challenges before we focus on what actually helps build resiliency and promote positive mental health and well-being among sexual and gender and romantic minorities? Woo.
I would say that a lot of these, to kind of counter what we were saying earlier, a student might have issues focusing in class or in any extracurricular activity if they're very focused on, for example, someone misgendered me. I need to use the washroom, but I'm not exactly sure where I'm supposed to go in this building. Am I safe in this environment saying these certain words and being true to who I am and whatnot? So I know some students would struggle with focusing on my music history lesson, for example, when there's other things in their mind going on. And this is not just a queer youth scenario. We know that students who have parents who are divorced and fighting also have this because they're thinking about, when I go home, who am I going to see type of a thing. So when things are happening in their head that are not focused on the class, rightfully so, they have a hard time with their grades, which obviously affects them later in life as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have to be aware and sensitive of the various traumas that people are experiencing. And exactly what you said. So it's really hard to thrive when you're just trying to survive in the school setting or in a community setting. So thank you for that. Okay, so let's move on now to thinking about some key protective factors. So as I said before, what actually helps bolster positive mental health and well-being among sexual, gender, and romantic minorities in particular? So who would like to start? Mal.
So something I've been thinking about lately is this issue of acceptance and belonging. So in the student affairs world, we're grappling with what does it mean for someone to feel like they, not just that they're welcome, but that they belong. And what I've learned recently is that when we say you're welcome here, we're actually still telling them that they're guests here. So they don't actually belong. And that was just mind-blowing for me because I had never thought of that. I say welcome all the time. And so, but we only say welcome to people who aren't actually part of our community. And so that really helped distinguish for the acceptance to the belonging. And so, and then a paper I was reading about, what it really means if we're actually using that word acceptance. I'm a nerd, sorry, paper. So it's my French and colleagues. Anyway, and it's about this, they call it a radical framework for healing for people of color. And psychological framework for healing. That's my background, is educational psychology. And what they're saying is that part of healing, instead of just coping for people who are experiencing marginalization, is this consciousness raising. So being able to name the fact that this discrimination is actually at the root of why I don't feel like I belong, and not that it's just something about me. And if I just change my identity or hid it, then it would go away. No, the reason why I'm having to experience this over and over again is because of the discrimination that's at the root of everything. So anyway, so my point is that when we talk about acceptance, I think it's also a protective factor is the for supportive educators, what supportive means to me is that we actually accept their identity as they tell us it is. We don't question it. We don't say, oh, that's so interesting, I never heard of that, tell me more. We don't ask them to be our educators about their identity. We accept it, and we do our own homework to know how we can support them.
Absolutely, and we have to go beyond acceptance in a way to celebrate affirmation and celebration as well. And that has to be weaved in and through the curricula. I think that's really, really important.
Kind of going off of that, one thing that we often do without meaning to is we often end up othering queer individuals by the way that we frame them, especially within I'm sure you've all seen, I'm sure you've heard about the bury your gays trope in media, which is basically just a trope that it's very common for a gay character to die, either at some point in the story, and that them dying is used as a plot device to serve the heterosexual or cisgender character. And so how this applies to our real life is that we often focus on the tragedy of being queer, and by talking about positive stories and celebrating queerness, we can also help by making them feel like they're innately accepted, because we celebrate heterosexuality and cisgenderedness all of the time. And then when we focus on the tragedy, not to say that we should ignore it and not think about it, but we have to make an effort to include more notions of queer celebration, because by doing that, we are removing that other. Because when you're saying oh, you're going to experience bullying and possibly violence, that others them, because that's not the norm that a lot of students might encounter. So you have to be mindful of the way that you're framing certain things.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't agree more, because often what happens in an educational setting is people will be like, oh, we will include sexual and gender minorities. Let's talk about HIV/AIDS. Let's talk about harassment and discrimination. And we don't ever talk about what I always talk about, the gift of lesbian love. And, and how... Because what often happens is with sexual and gender minorities, they are over-sexualized or objectified, and we don't actually think about romance, and we don't talk about healthy relationships and how the beauty in that. So thank you so much for mentioning that. And so what are some other protective factors? So what other things help bolster positive mental health and well-being? So we talked about not just acceptance and belonging, but that affirmation, that celebration. We talked about inclusive, but actually it would be more anti-heteronormative, anti-cis-normative curricula. So whether that's in the classroom, in formal teaching and learning spaces, or just your practices of speaking in ways that are inclusive in the hallways and things like that. Michael?
So when I was at Western, I read a paper, and I'm blanking on the name of it, but basically the article was suggesting that having a GSA in a school environment, or I guess in any environment, already helps your queer students and actually helps the entire school kind of secondhand in a way. So having your GSA, and if not having one, then seeing if there's room for one in your environment. One thing that came to mind was for GSAs, having some way to have your community a part of the GSA if the students are okay with that, to kind of show that like this GSA, it starts in this 4-wall room, but there are supports outside of the school, and that you're not just welcome here, you're welcome in other spaces as well, to show that when in the summertime the school is closed, there are pockets of communities who want to help that pocket grow, right? So I think that'd be a factor that would bolster their mental health well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not just participating in a Genders and Sexualities Alliance. The research suggests that actually just having one in the school actually helps students feel safer and more welcome. And that actually is not just for LGBT2Q plus students, it's actually for the whole student body. So people who are straight and or cisgender as well.
Kelsey?
Yeah, so I think one idea that can sort of help protect and have those protective factors is where like queer stories, queer experiences are seamlessly integrated into all areas of the curriculum. So it's not just, we're doing our gay week, and this is this is our gay artist that we're doing in our class. No, but it's just a part of everyday life, and it's not sort of a special project that we're doing, that it's every single day. And so I think that helps create that normalization of what it obviously should be.
Absolutely. It's similar with a lot of other minority identities. So we're not just going to include anti-racist content, during Black History Month. And we're not just going to include queer and trans kind of content during LGBT History Month. We want to integrate it throughout the entire year. Thank you. Callie?
Just a note on that, which kind of relates to when you pick a week to focus on and it doesn't even pertain necessarily just to queerness, but Black History, if you have your Black History Week or your queer, what you're doing is effectively othering. That because yes, obviously it's great to celebrate that period of time, but when that's the only time you talk about those things, you're othering that identity because you're letting them know that, oh, we're going to take this time to take a step away from what we normally talk about, and now we're going to talk about this. And so it's just a very effective, simple, often unintentional way of othering minority identities. But I think that one of the best key protective factors is literally just support. So that's in friends and family, but obviously, as we talked about, queer youth don't always have that luxury of having that support in friends and family. So being an adult and being kind of that first step of support for them, and that really just looks like being a decent human being. You're gonna have to bleep me out here, but literally don't be an asshole. That is the key to allyship 9 times out of 10, is just to be a decent human being with empathy. And I think that especially for teachers and educators, they're often in the best position to do that, especially when that youth is not getting it from friends and family.
Absolutely. Maisha?
I think just to add on to it, one of the roles that I also play, that I train graduate students to be decent psychologists. Actually last Friday I was facilitating group supervision on how do you create safe and equitable spaces for LGBTQ+ youth. And the first, and these are emerging trainees, so they're very early on in their training. And the first group of answers is, I'm going to put the biggest pride flag, I'm going to have all the stickers, and you're like, that's great. But then when I walk into your space, what is your body language, your facial expression, and the statements that come out of your mouth that makes any youth be like, you got me, right? You get me, you understand me, and you will not be judged. So I think sometimes we have to just go back to, yes, we want to create space by external modalities as well, but I often ask my psychology trainees that, what do you do to become a compassionate, openly curious, and non-judgmental and accepting psychologist? And it goes back to language. One of my biggest pet peeves is when psychologists ask, I have never heard about that, why don't you tell me more about this? And you're like, no, it is not their job to educate you on their experience. And if you don't have that competency, then you should not be working with those youth then. So I think yes, we say we need more support, but also the support has to be equitable, anti-oppressive, accepting, and decent supports. That's the word that I'm going to take on today.
Abby?
I'm just listening and I'm reflecting and trying to develop my understanding of this, and I'm thinking about this in the context of a school, and I realized that if we had to break this down into 3 categories, I think that institutional, personal, and instructional supports. So in terms of institutional supports, I think space design says a lot about how inclusive you are. I mean, I don't think it's fair for students to even think what washroom they need to use. That is something you need to be mindful of before you even design that sort of space. That says a lot about how inclusive you are. And then personal support systems in terms of the GSA, which is an important support system, but also the mental health and spec ed department, and how do the different curricular departments interact with each other. So it's not just one teacher's responsibility to support the student, but the whole school community to work with that particular student. And then instructional strategies, I feel like simple things like just introducing your pronouns or starting off with your pronouns and doing that on a daily basis normalizes queer identities. You don't just do it because somebody tells you to do it, but you do it because it's something that is normal. And then even in your subjects, and people often say English is the only way, or certain liberal arts are the only way, but then when you're teaching math, talk about queer mathematicians. When you're teaching music, talk about musicians that have done really well, that have queer identities. And I feel like doing this on a daily basis, not just because it's something that you have to do, is a great way to get started, but institutional, personal, and instructional strategies is how I hope that actually trickles down into the school environment.
Absolutely. Any last contributions?
I'm so glad you're here because I'm learning a lot right now from the way you can break down those frameworks. I think for me, I'm thinking more these days about curriculum, probably because I'm an educational developer, so I got that on the brain. And what I'm thinking now is, a lot of the time when we're talking about, making your curriculum more diverse and these kinds of things, it always seems like just one more atom, one more lens, one more frame. But often the pushback is, this is in the canon, and there's just nobody who has a different identity who's in this canon, and that's the reason. And so I'm wondering and say there's some kind of restriction that you can't change it, to make it intentional to talk about, whose voices are missing from this thing that we're reading right now? What about a perspective that we haven't thought about, right? Or if this is the protagonist, right, and they're acting on this person, what's the perspective of that person, right? And how would it have felt to be, right, this kind of identity in this situation? And I think that's what I'm thinking this right now. So that's what I'm going to use moving forward. I'm speaking to educators who feel locked into their curriculum in ways that we can really affirm and celebrate, like you said, queer youth and queer identities.
Well, look at our history curriculum
Yeah,
and the way that it's framed and who it leaves out, and it's unfortunate because it happens for pretty much any minority you can think of, and those voices are always excluded and left out.
Yeah. So thank you all for your contributions. I'm just going to summarize everything. So basically, people have talked about the importance of having natural support. So from, parents, caregivers, people who you live with is very, very important, and or having a peer group or having friends that are supportive. So if obviously you don't have natural supports in the terms of family, the family you were born into, having a chosen family is really incredibly important. And we talked about, the importance of identifying, so understanding self and knowing how you locate in terms of your identities and ways of being, right? And how that is influenced by the different resources or information that you're exposed to and through schooling. And actually connecting with other LGBT2Q plus individuals is incredibly important. So that's why GSAs are really a safe haven for a lot of folks where they can learn, share, exchange information and supports and develop coping strategies and things like that. And then obviously community groups too. So there's a lot of LGBT2Q plus community groups that you can refer youth to. Another thing is actually experiencing positive responses when you're coming out. So obviously we want to steer away from like, I knew it! I know you always look different, or something like that. Or, acting surprised or shocked because, you perceive them to be heterosexual or you perceive them to be cisgender for as long as you've known them. So it's really important to meet people where they're at, not make assumptions, and to thank people for trusting in you with this information, and obviously keeping that to yourself unless they give you explicit permission to share that with other folks, right? Having supportive adults in school, so having a GSA advisor obviously is really important because at least there's one person in the school community that would be, hopefully widely known as someone who has LGBT2Q affirmative values and beliefs. But obviously having every teacher, obviously, who is a decent human being and who is not oppressive would be ideal. Educators and also administrators and counselors, all school staff, whether that's custodial staff or people who work in the office, is really important. Having anti-homophobic and anti-transphobic policies are incredibly important. Having anti-racist policies, so super important. So having them enumerated, so not just having generic anti-bullying policies, but to actually name. No, you cannot discriminate based on sexual orientation, based on race, based on class, based on all of these different factors that are protected under all the human rights codes across Canada. And then having effective interventions. So obviously, there is legislation, provincially and then territorially. So when something negatively impacts the school environment, so when something racist happens, when something Islamophobic happens, when something that is genderist happens, that teachers know that they, in an Ontario context, for example, that they have to report and respond. So that is in accordance to keeping our kids safe bill. So actually, effectively intervening is huge. And then the last thing that we've already talked about is, having inclusive curricula and resources. So whether that's in the libraries, whether that's access to some really important online websites and things like that that are actually not censored in the school community, to actually have the everyday teaching and learnings integrate positive representations and affirmative celebratory representations of LGBTQ plus identities and ways of being and successes is very, very important. So thank you all for participating, and that's a wrap.